Hi! I promise you one day my background will actually look nice, but today is not the day. Today is the day we talk about is there nothing new in fashion thing. Because when you're interested in historical fashion, it kind of ruins things for you, you know? You can't fully enjoy watching period dramas because you're too focused on whether or not the costumes are nice. And even fashion shows or like fashion collections lose their charms to you because you've seen it all before. Not to mention all the breakthrough fashion items that have been around for literally centuries, or the TikTok fashion hacks that have already been around in 1864. And then you hear that people are obsessed with a celebrity's red carpet look, and you have a look at that and you're like, I've seen that before multiple times. And because of that, sometimes you just can't help to think, is there really nothing new in fashion? Is this just a never-ending recycling circle of ideas, you know? But like, surprisingly, I'm not a fan of oversimplifying things. And I'm usually skeptical as to the actual reasons that things are happening, especially when it comes to history. So explanations such as, oh, we just got lazy, or we just don't have taste anymore, don't really work for me, you know? So is the fashion nowadays really just recycling the same ideas over and over? First of all, rediscovering old styles is nothing new, and most of the iconic Western fashion styles and trends have borrowed significant ideas from the past. For example, the craziness of the 1830s with the wide off-shoulder sleeves can be credited to 17th century gowns. And a very similar sleeve design was also around 1890s. Late 40s and early 50s new look is, I guess, one of the most groundbreaking 20th century silhouettes. But did you know a similar style evolved around 1916? Did you know that? Did you? And the statuesque styles that you can see in downtown— was that a fly? Excuse me, I'm trying to make a video here. The statuesque styles that you could see in Downton Abbey were heavily inspired by the styles of the early 19th century, but those fashions were in turn inspired by the actual classical garments of the ancient Greece and Rome. So taking a visually recognizable fashion silhouette and sort of adding a new twist to it is just the way fashion has naturally progressed for a long time. But is there anything different about the way trends are recycled nowadays? What was that vocal fry? Nowadays. Hi guys, my name is Carolina. Nice to have you here on my channel today. That's how my American friends talk sometimes. First of all, the recycled trends were often the base of a particular style, but most of the time they were just an addition. For example, some 1880s gowns, but not all, featured Renaissance inspirations. And yet the mainstream style and like the mainstream silhouette of 1880s cannot really be traced to a particular era before that time. And some 1920s gowns were influenced by the Egyptomania, but the particular style with loose waist and shorter skirts, it didn't really appear in Western women's fashion before that. So while a lot of the trends in fashion history were almost direct copy of some previous styles, most of the time the twist was actually the center of the look. And the historical inspiration, it was just like a little spice scattered on top, you know? I'm just showing off my bracelet here, I hope you guys like it. I'm not. Let's get back to the video. And a good example of that might be some 1870s dresses. On one hand, you can clearly see 18th century inspirations. The neckline, the decoration, the floral patterns, the hats, the sleeves, the use of flounces and lace, you know. But the overall look of 1870s dresses cannot really be mistaken for 18th century. Like, this skirt is trained, it's bustled, it's long, the waist is slightly raised, the neckline is much more shallow. So still, the base of the look is unmistakably 1870s, right? So that's one thing. The second thing is the borrowing of different styles usually happens in circles. And those circles tended to be quite wide because fashion changed a lot slower in previous centuries. And it also took a lot longer until the outdated styles were cool again. If I was about to draw a fashion timeline of borrowed trends and silhouettes until like mid-20th century, it would look something like this. So you can see that they're reaching quite far back, right? And things were reappearing in fashion relatively slowly. And some trends were even recycled after several centuries. And yes, this is something that still happens today to a certain degree. For example, the big off-shoulder sleeve trend, it could be echoing 1830s fashions, or, you know, the 18th century style stays that the cottagecore is so in love with. But it usually takes around a decade or two for things to be thrown into the big trend recycle bin again. And this in turn makes us feel as if we've seen it all before, because the image of those styles is still pretty much vivid in our heads, because it just happened like 10 or 20 years ago. Like, most of us remember it, unless you're an infant. And unlike 1870s fashion that I used as an example, modern designs very rarely come with an original, visually recognizable base that is then adorned with some interesting details inspired by previous styles. You know what I'm talking about? Like, it's usually an actual previous style, but sort of updated. Like the bodycon dresses of the 1990s, which are nowadays sort of refurbished and sold as a new style. Another thing is, minimalism and simplification are not friends of groundbreaking designs either. Like, you can always make things more complex and more complicated, which is why I personally think that modern haute couture shows are still quite interesting, because there's a lot of things happening and you can still work with that. But when it comes to minimalistic, simple garments, there is only so much you can work with. Like, you can't go more minimalistic than a tank top, because then you're just getting naked, and like, that's not fashion, that's just nature. So after a while it has to become repetitive, because you have a very little space to work with, you know? Yes, you get the fabric, you get the texture, you maybe get sewing techniques, but the overall silhouette that you're working with is very limiting when you look at Western fashion throughout history. It was changing like that. Also, a lot of big fashion houses seem to be sort of haunted, spooky season, by the legacy of some groundbreaking fashion geniuses. Like, everything they do is always an homage to the big names that established a house, except a bit more mild and less innovative and, well, worse. For example, I absolutely love Schiaparelli's new collection, and I think the Bella Hadid Khan dress was amazing. But the sole reason I loved the design so much was because they continued Schiaparelli's legacy that she already established in the 1930s. So if it wasn't for her experimental work in the times when, you know, such frivolous and kitsch art was absolutely shocking in mainstream fashion, I don't think the Bella Hadid dress would ever have been made, you know? One interesting aspect of the trend recycle culture might be, what is the most readable visual cue that makes it possible for us to identify fashions at particular periods in time? That sentence was complicated and it didn't make sense. For example, if we look at 1920s photos, we usually are able to tell it's 1920s because we just see the fashions and we're like, that's 1920s. And then we look at 1950s movie screen caps, we're usually able to tell it's a 1950s movie. So with the evolution of fashion that is no longer tied to a single dominant silhouette, and with the emergence of vintage fashions entering the mainstream, what differentiates 80s and 90s photos from modern photos? Like, we're wearing the same clothes practically, so what's the difference? And it's usually the hair, the makeup, and the accessories, mainly shoes. So the difference between these two pictures lies mostly in the eyebrows, the hair. So these are all relatively small details, which also contribute to the feeling of, hey, I've seen this one before. It was nearly identical. There is nothing new in fashion. But I think the biggest contributor of the repetitive feeling of modern clothing is, surprise, surprise, fast fashion. So we all complain about modern fashion being repetitive and boring and conforming, but the truth is we cannot expect fast fashion to develop the same way that slow fashion developed for centuries. We can't expect fast fashion to be detailed and visually appealing every time and fun and innovative and breaking the mold and unlike anything we've seen before. And here is why. Fashion Nova releases 1,000 styles a week. Like, and Shine releases 1,000 new styles daily. So like, it's not even physically possible for all the designs to be innovative and interesting. It's like, with that speed, it's just not going to happen. And whatever the big designers come up with, no matter how innovative or cool that is always going to be just an empty idea if it cannot be directly translated to mainstream fashion. It's just going to stay a meme, you know, like Balenciaga designs. They're just memes. So as shit as it is, unless we as a society sort of reform the way we think about clothing, and unless we distance ourselves from the idea of constantly having to update our wardrobes, things are most likely not going to slow down. And that trend recycling cycle is just going to get shorter and shorter because we don't even have the time to sit down and come up with new ideas. As depressing as it sounds, I've heard that vintage fashion is getting bigger than ever, which obviously to me, like, that's a good thing. So I personally am hoping that we'll get to a certain level of speed with fashion that we're just gonna be like, I'm jumping out of this train, like I can't do it anymore. I mean, getting new clothes is exhausting, let's face it. It costs money, it costs time, and constantly worrying about being fashionable is exhausting. 0 out of 10 would not recommend. So I personally think that we will come to a point where we just will have to slow down, and that's where fashion will truly flourish. That being said, I discovered a really cool donut shop in my city, so I'm just gonna go and give it a try because I've been working so hard last month. Like, I released 0 videos, so I deserve a break. Eat your donuts. Bye. What the hell?